Hey everyone, welcome to the most opinionated space podcast on the internet.
Ad Astra, the podcast where we talk about the intersection between space, policy, and technology.
I'm Jack, your resident space policy advocate.
And I'm Newton, I'm your guy for space technology.
All right, so it's been 2 weeks now since our last episode.
And all sorts of shenanigans have taken place.
Oh, so many shenanigans. We can't even list them.
Yeah.
The number of shenanigans.
I'll give it a shot, though. So, starting with latest in Washington today, we're going to cover FAA getting a little bit of a boost, getting a little bit of extra cheddar. Space Corps rearing its ugly head once again. Pace saying that SPD-2 is on the president's desk. And then in Space News Highlight of the Week, someone got an administrator. Have you heard about this? Have you seen this?
No,
I have. Has this been in the news lately at all?
I feel like nobody's covering this.
No one's talking about the fact that NASA got a new administrator. I'm doing the Donald Trump hand thing. If
he is, I can corroborate that.
We're skipping international news because nobody got time for that. Latest in tech, we're going to talk a little bit about Blue Origin launching New Shepard for the 8th time. And then we'll talk a little bit about some lunar shenanigans that have been going on with Resource Prospector, to be specific. And then Galileo Spacecraft being the gift that keeps on giving. All right, Jack, get us started. Tell us a little bit about the FAA.
All right. So the FAA is the Federal Aviation Administration. We all know them as the people that make sure the planes in the sky don't, hit each other, and we get from point A to point B in a pretty safe and effective manner. FAA is also in charge of space traffic management. So the FAA has this office called the Office of Commercial Spaceflight, and for whatever reason, the acronym for it is AST. And in the FAA reauthorization that just passed the House, just back in end of April, so a couple days ago. We're recording this on May 1st. Happy May Day, by the way.
Hey.
By a vote of 393 to 13, pretty bipartisan vote here, voted to approve half of the debate on the bill, the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018. And in it raises the AST's authorized budget from its 2018 level, the level it was kept at with inflation over time, of about $22.6 million, and raises it to $33 million in 2019, and further raises it every year to the level of $76 million by the year 2023. That's a threefold increase over 5 years.
Now, Jack, here's my question. Does that agree with what was in the president's skinny budget for the last couple of years?
So the fun thing is that the president's skinny budget hardly even talks about FAA AST. However, this is all happening in context of what we'll get to later with what Executive Secretary Pace is talking about with this SPD-2, that the administration is sort of, with the National Space Council, taken ownership of space traffic management and debris avoidance and tracking of objects in space. AST is the civilian side of the government that does that. So the Air Force does a lot of the tracking and traffic management in space, but AST is for everything civil. It grants all of the launch licenses. It does all of the regulatory work that commercial spaceflight companies have to go through in order to launch a vehicle. So even if it's an Air Force payload, like Falcon Heavy 2 is going to be launching an Air Force satellite, they have to go through FAA AST to get that launch license for the Air Force. So what this effectively does, this increase in budget, is it raises the capability of this office to perform these tasks. And within that $76 million by 2023, there's going to be staff hirings. There's going to be maybe expanding the office space, buying more paper. I mean, it's $76 million that will go towards the mission of the Office of Commercial Spaceflight.
So you actually think it's going towards any new programs within that office, or just sort of improving what's already there?
It's going to be improving what's already there. As we've seen in previous iterations of the AST, their sole purpose is to regulate commercial spaceflight, and they have been able to keep up with trends in spaceflight, but as the cadence of launches increases with Blue Origin getting better capabilities, with SpaceX improving on their capabilities, and with legislation already in the docket, in the hopper, in the House to talk about expanding the role of FAA AST, as we talked about last time, in terms of what is defined as a space vehicle. The FAA AST is going to have a much broader horizon to look at of the things that it does, and it's going to need more resources, whether that is full-time equivalents, FTEs, which is just government speak for people, whether that's a contractor or an actual government employee is to question. The paper products they need, the pens to mark up launch licenses, like these things cost money. And so AST is going to have to spend money. Now, what is important to note is that this is an authorization. And as we've talked a lot about in previous episodes, there is a huge difference between authorization and appropriation. This is not the House giving $76 million to FAA AST. What this amendment would do would be it would expand the amount of money that the appropriators, the Appropriation Committee, and specifically the Appropriation Subcommittee for Transportation, can put money towards FAA AST. So this isn't Congress saying, oh, well, we're planning out the budget to 2023. It's saying we're giving FAA AST the expanded option to have that amount of money. Now, we could get to fiscal year 2023 and the Congress is at a stalemate, or there is some external event happening where we can't spend that $76 million. That doesn't mean that Congress has to spend that money, but that it's allowed to spend up to that amount. So it's the cap at which they can spend. Though budgetary caps are another thing, but it's basically saying that this is the recommended amount that FAA should have for the Office of Commercial Space Transportation. So it's very confusing sometimes looking at this, and this amendment has passed the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure and needs to pass as a whole within the House at large. Which seems likely. I mean, it was a 393-13 vote to allow these amendments. I think they're going to pass pretty easily. In the House, the Senate's going to deliberate and maybe move some numbers around. There's going to have to go to conference and iron out the differences and send it to the president's desk. So I think it's likely that we're going to see this change within FAA AST. It's also such a small percentage of the budget. I don't think anyone's going to be so hung up on this number that they're going to not vote for it, or enough people. Obviously, 13 people voted against allowing these amendments to be voted on. But that there's going to be a concerted effort over these, this extra $54 million. So I look forward to seeing how the appropriators approach this as we get into more budget talks, as we get closer and closer to that September 30th date when fiscal year 2018 ends and 2019 begins, because that'll be telling, because this amendment allows for $33 million for fiscal year 2019. If the appropriators actually follow through on that, or if September 30th is the fiscal cliff that we're careening towards, maybe we'll have a government shutdown and not have an FAA AST for a while. But that's all up in the air, and we will keep everyone up to date as this moves forward. I know it can sort of be confusing, so also send all questions to us on Facebook, facebook.com/@astropodcast. Newton, anything else on AST?
I've got nothing for FAA right now.
Not launching anything anytime soon?
No plans. No, I'm good. I'm good.
Well, so the next thing that's happening in Washington is Space Corps is rearing its ugly head again. We've talked a lot about this in extended detail over the last year and change that we've even been a podcast, and even well before that. And
yes, but just much like every comic book or comic book movie, every podcast is someone's first podcast. So let's at least define what is Space Corps. Let's start with that.
So the idea would be that just as the Marine Corps exists as a branch of the military underneath the Navy, organizationally speaking, functionally they are a separate branch, but as an organization they are a part of the Navy, that the Space Corps would exist as a unified body within the Air Force. Almost kind of like how the Air Force was a unified body of all air assets under the Army prior to 1947.
I was going to say, because what they're looking at doing is actually making Space Corps a separate branch, to the best of my understanding, correct?
It would essentially be a repeat of how the Marine Corps exists. So yeah, it would functionally be a separate branch. They would have their own facilities that would be a Space Corps facility, but as an organization, the head of the Space Corps would technically be underneath the head of the Air Force, but would be consulted as if they were a separate branch of the military.
I think, you know what, I think there's been multiple proposals at this point, because I do remember at one point them saying that they were actually going to pitch it as a proposed sixth branch of the United States Armed Forces. And it basically...
They include the Marine Corps as one of those five branches, even though organizationally speaking, it's not.
Right, it's not. Right.
And there's also different verbiage that people use.
Yeah.
People use Space Corps to describe it in that aspect. But sometimes they'll say Space Corps when really they're thinking of Space Force, which it would be akin to what the Air Force became after it left the Army in 1947, that it is one of the five branches of military. Or what? Six, I guess.
So we get that they're trying to break it off from Air Force, and effectively it would exist of a bunch of different already existing Air Force organizations, and they are trying to address several problems here. Right now, there's 60 different organizations that basically govern space command and control. There's, I believe the stats were there are 11 that are in charge of oversight, 8 with acquisition, and then 6 others to define like requirements for space systems, and a bunch other that I don't remember off the top of my head. And there's no single entity or individual that's actually in charge of any of those 3 efforts. To sort of have that sort of central command. And I believe, and as far as I understand, the reason they wanted to have to make up Space Corps is so that they can have an organization that pulls all of that together and has a sufficient focus on warfighting in space.
Yeah, the idea is to have a unified command. What form that takes is sort of up in the air, whether it's exists under the Air Force still, if it's its own branch, if it's a underneath strategic command, which as it stands, we don't have a Spacecom anymore. That was done away with in the mid 2000s, and we haven't, everything sort of strategic obviously falls under strategic command. It was the amalgam of cyber and space and all the things that don't necessarily fit within
but cyber has been
air command.
It's a whole different,
well, and that's the thing is cyber was underneath strategic command and was pulled out because of the rising nature of cyber as a warfighting domain, not in the traditional warfighting domain sense, but in the new mode of warfighting that it's sort of created. And it's the same thing in space. A space war is not what you think it's going to be. It's not lightsabers and
it's not Star Wars.
It's not laser swords and all that stuff, right? It's much more complex than that, and it's not
attacking
as
space.
direct.
It's attacking space assets in order to wipe out pieces of other nation states' critical infrastructure.
It's infrastructure warfare basically.
Yeah, that's
the idea behind Space Corps, Spacecom, Space Force, Space whatever is that it will allow us to better prepare for I guess, the inevitability of space warfare as it's currently thought of, and also allow us to move the ship quicker. I mean, because if you have 60 different organizations underneath the Air Force, under Navy, under Army, all the different strategic command, like who's boss, there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty. So if something happens or you expect something to happen, it's much harder to move 60 different pieces than to move one big piece.
At the same time, you have 60 different pieces reacting to the same threat and getting information about the same threat.
And with different doctrines under each branch of the military, their reactions are going to be different. And just overall, it's better to start centralizing these things, as we have started to do with cyber, so that when X event happens, when the space Pearl Harbor happens, we're more prepared for it than if we weren't. Granted, I guess intrinsically a space Pearl Harbor would not be as expected, but whatever. So the idea here, and this has been fought for by many representatives, specifically the subcommittee chairman for the House Armed Services Committee, Mike Rogers, Republican from Alabama, has been a huge advocate on this. And he is pushing forward in this new National Defense Authorization Act for 2019 that there be the establishment of a, quote, subordinate unified command for space underneath U.S. Strategic Command. So under STRATCOM, there would be a unified body for all things space. And that unit could, and by unit, I don't mean like a military unit. I mean that unit of government could then expand as space as a warfighting domain expands and become a space corps or become a space force as the need arises and as the doctrine evolves. But it's not, as Rogers and a number of other representatives were pushing for in the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act, which was the full-fledged creation of a space force by 2020, which was an extremely ambitious endeavor, or Space Corps. It was, I already misspoke. They wanted a Space Corps by 2020, not a Space Force. Although the president has insisted that a Space Force was the next move that the administration should make towards establishing space as a warfighting domain, but it's also the president talking, and we can't take everything that he says as gospel of what the administration's really vying for. So yeah, I mean, it's another step, and I think it's a more measured step in the direction that we do need to go. And we agree philosophically. I'm including you, Newton, into this because I think we've had enough conversations that we agree philosophically with Mike Rogers that we will eventually need something like a Space Corps or Space Force, but maybe not as urgently as they wanted in the 2018 NDAA.
The problem. So let me be clear about the problem with doing it so urgently. The issue here is who you actually. So right now, if they were to create a Space Force, of those 60 organizations that they would pull together, they would pull together about 3 of them, and all 3 are ones that are in the Air Force, and if that's the case, then there's really not a point in having one. You need to come up with a strategic plan to take all 60 of those assets, all 60 of those different organizations, and pull them together into one central command. You can't do that quickly. You need to have a significant long-term plan to do that. And that's my concern with doing it over the next few years. It's going out and just establishing this command, starting with even those 3 organizations. Just you need to actually plan this out and have each of the different agencies that have those space organizations as a part of their agency have a strategic plan for interacting with this new agency in order to do this smoothly. There needs to be a smooth transition into a Space Corps, not a leap into a Space Corps because, oh my God, people can attack our space assets now.
Yeah, it's a natural evolution of capability, or organizationally and technologically. And this is not something that's just happening within the halls of Congress, even within the administration, within the Department of Defense. General J. Raymond, who is the commander for the Air Force Space Command, because under each branch of the military, there is different commands in the same way that there is the joint U.S. Strategic Command. And General Raymond was made the Joint Force Space Component Commander, which is sort of the next step up from it just being within the Air Force. So it's part of U.S. Strategic Command, but it's not so far up there that it's it's a component command. It's not a full part of Strategic Command. It's a lot of this almost seems arbitrary when you look at it, but within the military, it's order is everything, and how you approach a problem is determined in large part by who your boss is and where the problem exists in physical space as well as in the organization. So this is just another step in that natural progression, or supposedly natural progression, that we keep talking about, of space becoming, like cyber, its own unified command within Strategic Command, and then maybe outside of that, and maybe Space Corps, Space Force, and Space Nation. I don't know. The future is uncertain, but there is still talk about this, and it looks like it's moving in a pretty reasoned, logical manner. So I'll be interested to see if the 2019 NDAA final version actually has this line in it. So speaking of space traffic management, though we were sort of speaking about this a little bit before, this Space Policy Directive 2, as we're sort of assuming it's going to be, because that's the form in which the other Space Policy Directive has existed within the National Space Council, is supposedly, according to Scott Pace, who is the Executive Secretary of the National Space Council, that this space traffic management policy is on the president's desk. Quote, Pace said it is, quote, on that large piece of furniture known as the president's desks. I'm hoping we will have an announcement fairly soon. It's been a productive interagency process, and I think we've reached a fairly good consensus. And this was said at the Hudson Institute seminar that Pace was speaking at just a day ago, as of the recording of this podcast. So it's there's not really much news other than that, that maybe we'll get an announcement, hopefully sooner rather than later, because space traffic management, as we've talked about, is a very important thing. And the sooner you can get on top of the problem, the better. The longer we wait, the worse the problem will probably become. So anything on that, Newton? Just quick little update.
Nothing on that.
And I guess we're on to our Space News highlight of the week. So as we've talked about, as long as this show has been on, we have talked about Jim Bridenstine. We've talked about the rumor of Jim Bridenstine. Yeah. There's Jim Bridenstine the man, and then there's Jim Bridenstine the myth. And we were talking about the myth for a long time, and then he actually became the nominee back in end of September last year for the administration's pick for NASA administrator. And with the retirement of Robert Lightfoot as acting administrator on April 20th, the administration and Congress and the entire space program was posed with this existential threat that there isn't anyone to fill the shoes as acting administrator who isn't already acting as an associate administrator of NASA. I guess this is one of the residual effects of an administration that doesn't have all of its offices, its political appointees figured out within the first year. With Robert Lightfoot retiring, there was this renewed sense of urgency on the Hill that we need someone to replace him and lead NASA as an organization full time. They weren't doing any other jobs or looking at the exit door. And Bridenstine was, for many, a very controversial pick. But for many within the space community, it was a very logical pick. He is really the only member of Congress that has taken as keen an interest in space policy as he has, putting forward the Space Renaissance Act, every year that he's been in Congress, and really championing some major changes within NASA reauthorizations and even in the appropriation process, even though he's not a member of the appropriation subcommittee that deals with space. So Bridenstine was a pretty natural pick, many thought, for the administration, but because of his views on, or stated views on, climate change and LGBT people and basically everything that didn't deal with space, many people within the Democratic caucus and even some within the Republican caucus conference saw him as unfit for the position of administrator. Here on the show, we've had a very back and forth opinion of him. It's sort of, he's the best we got right now with the administration that we have, and NASA really needs a leader because these next now 2.5 years are instrumental in laying the foundation for what the space program looks like going into the 2020s and 2030s, when supposedly we're supposed to be sending humans to orbit Mars. And it's not just a human spaceflight thing. There's robotic exploration that we see this trailing off of the Mars exploration program in the mid to late 2020s. The next big and really only outer planets mission is going to be going to Europa Clipper, and it's kind of an uncertain future right now for the space program.
Yeah. Well, so and I don't want to pretend like all of the other things that people have been talking about, aren't true. I mean, he has made horrific statements about same-sex marriage. He's made terrible statements about climate change. But as I said in a previous podcast, quite frankly, this is one of the scenarios where we just have to take the W, because no one that this administration is going to submit as their nominee for the next NASA administrator is going to be better than Bridenstine, at least for NASA. So at the end of the day, I mean, he's kind of the best we got. It's not great, but he is for NASA funding. Ordinarily, I wouldn't take that, but I wouldn't want us to just settle for something like that. But we're not in an ordinary circumstance. And
we don't have the luxury to push it off, too.
Yeah, I mean, he literally said he's not going to touch climate science, and actually, in this case, I believe him. He's voted for NASA funding to support NASA programs across the board. So I don't see him carrying out any missions to destroy climate science or anything like that, particularly over a few years being head of NASA.
The position of administrator is not one of setting policy; it's of running an organization. And of course, he is going to be on the Hill advocating from a point of, as Lightfoot has, as Bolden did, as any administrator, you go to the Congress when something is happening regarding the program, and you go and you testify and you say, this is what we're seeing. This is what my staff tells me. This is what I see when I go to the NASA centers. You are at points the intermediary between Congress and the space program, and who knows Congress better but a member of Congress. And in times like these, where Congress has taken the lead on setting most major space policy with the NASA authorization just this last year and the potential for another NASA reauthorization, let's stress how historic that is, that within 2 years of a NASA authorization, we get another one. It's going to be a very tumultuous time for the space program, especially as the administration sort of has this back and forth relationship with how it uses the National Space Council. And I mean, they're doing a lot of work, but the Congress is leading a lot of the major changes in national space policy. And who better to have on the other side of the desk than someone who understands the concerns of members of Congress, but also has always been on the side of the space program and trying to push it further into the stars. So that's sort of my thoughts on it. Yes, I don't think Bridenstine is the best choice. If we could pick anybody, he would not I don't think he would not even really make the top 5 for me.
It would make the top 50 for it. But anyway, he's the best we got. All right.
And just so the breakdown of how the vote went down. So there were 2 Republican senators who were planning to vote against allowing Bridenstine to be confirmed, and those were Marco Rubio of Florida and Jeff Flake of Arizona, 2 who have had political differences as well as philosophical differences with Bridenstine for a number of years, and Flake being a retiring senator and has had a number of Twitter feuds with the president. There has sort of been this fear that these 2 Republican senators would hold back and not vote for Bridenstine, and he would not become administrator ever. And that's something we did talk about on a few episodes of the show. But I think with the urgency created by Lightfoot leaving on April 20th, as well as maybe some backroom dealings with the administration, it does seem like maybe there was not a major deal but that there was some conversation that was happening in the backroom between members of the president's political team, maybe even the president himself or vice president, and Rubio and Flake. And at the basically 11th hour for the confirmation, both Rubio and Flake changed their votes, making it a 50-48 vote in favor of advancing Bridenstine to the position of administrator.
Yep. Well, best of luck, Mr. Bridenstine.
You're gonna need it.
You're gonna need it. All right, moving on to latest in tech. We're just going to hit these stories real quick because we need to get out of here because I need to go to work in the morning. So, Bezos launched a rocket. That happened. Blue Origin's New Shepard suborbital system aced its highest test flight yet over the weekend. And yeah, there's video online. Basically, the New Shepard booster capsule combo reached a maximum altitude of nearly 66 miles. That's 107 kilometers for our European friends during or friends in the rest of the world. They were kidding.
in the civilized part of the world.
in the world who's not run by a crazy dictator. During the flight. And then each component came back down to Earth safely. The rocket landed vertically, where have we heard that before, on a designated pad, and the capsule glided down softly under parachutes, throwing up a cloud of dust when it hit the desert floor. The mission officially reached space, flying higher than like I said, 67 miles, and basically, once again, this is Bezos trying to compete, maybe not necessarily directly with SpaceX, because they're going for somewhat of a different mission, but to be in a similar market as them. Once again, this is the 8th suborbital flight for the New Shepard system. The rocket and capsule have aced their landings on all of those flights except the first one, which took place in April 2015. On that mission, the capsule touched down safely, but the booster crashed during its landing attempt. Basically, if all continues to go well with these programs, New Shepard should actually start carrying people to suborbital space and back. And Blue Origin was ballsy enough to say that they could do that as early as this year, which no, they're not. But
we know commercial space flight too well.
yeah. But it's pretty impressive. So congrats, Bezos. When you have all the money in the world, you should be able to land a rocket. All right. Especially since it's already been done. No, seriously though, props to Blue Origin. I'm glad we have multiple commercial organizations landing rockets now. That's actually that's overall it's good for space research and rocketry research. You got anything to say on that?
No, just
right.
I mean, like just echoing what you are already saying.
Yeah. Okay. Echo. All right. Anyway, there's some lunar drama going on. A lunar rover mission that struggled to win support at NASA even after a change in space exploration policy will no longer be pursued as the agency turns its attention to commercial lunar lander services. NASA released a brief statement on April 27th, confirming that it no longer planned to fly the Resource Prospector mission. Now, this mission was a lunar rover that was intended to travel into permanently shadowed regions of the lunar poles and assess the ability to extract water ice, a potentially valuable resource for future human missions. This was meant to be our first mining expedition on another world of any kind. Using a suite of instruments, it was going to locate elements in those polar regions and excavate not just water ice, but other volatiles such as hydrogen and oxygen, components that make up water ice as well. Building on the findings of the Lunar Crater Observation and Sensing Satellite, or otherwise known as LCROSS, and LRO, which is the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter missions, that proved the existence of water on the moon in the first place. This was supposed to be the next step to access those resources. Parts of the Prospector will still end up on the moon in a series of robotic missions. The statement that NASA released claimed that this expanded campaign reinforces Trump's initial instructions, which were officially called the President's Space Policy Directive 1. I believe we reported on that a little while ago. Apparently, however, the scientific community seems to disagree with this move. And they don't believe that it will help get us any closer to human boots on lunar soil. They released a group called the Lunar Exploration Analysis Group, or League, released an open letter to NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, first day of the job, stating that this action is viewed with both incredulity and dismay by our community, especially as the President's Space Policy Directive 1 directs NASA to go to the lunar surface. The letter that they released noted that the Resource Prospector was, in fact, the only polar lander moon rover being developed by any nation. All of the international missions, of which there are 6 planned between now and 2025, planned for the lunar poles, are by static landers. So, yeah, the science community is upset. We are not sure what NASA is actually going to be doing going forward with this, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Wait and see. NASA.
U.S. government. Moving on to some good news about space. The Galileo spacecraft. It's the gift that keeps on giving. So, NASA's Galileo mission ended way back in 2003. Way in the Wayback Machine. Back in the high school days, for me at least. But data collected during the spacecraft's first flyby of Ganymede has yielded fresh insights into the Jovian moon's unique electromagnetic field. New analysis of the Ganymede data has helped scientists better understand the unusual shape and structure of the moon's magnetosphere. So let's talk a little bit about history here. And I'm going to keep this quick so that we can get off here. But back in 1996, shortly after arriving at Jupiter, Galileo made a very surprising discovery, that Ganymede had its own magnetic field. Okay, and we've talked about magnetic fields before, in places like Mercury as well as the Earth, so on and so forth. On previous podcasts. Now, while most planets in our solar system, including Earth, have magnetic environments known as magnetic spheres, no one at the time expected a moon to have one. And between 1996 and 2000, Galileo made 6 targeted flybys of Ganymede, with multiple instruments collecting up all sorts of data on the moon's magnetosphere. These included the spacecraft's plasma subsystem, which measured the density, temperature, and direction of the plasma, excited electrically charged gas, if you will. That's what I mean when I say plasma, that was flowing through the environment around Galileo. And now new results that have recently been published in the journal Geophysical Research Letters revealed that interesting details from that data about the magnetosphere's unique structure. The new results showed a stormy scene. Particles blasted off the moon's icy surface as a result of incoming plasma rain, and strong flows of plasma pushed between Jupiter and Ganymede due to an explosive magnetic event occurring between the two bodies' magnetic environments. Scientists think these observations could be the key to unlocking the secrets of the moon. And the reason that this is important is it shows that Ganymede actually does have an effect on Jupiter's magnetosphere, or at least it once did. the researchers now believe that this is also what explains the extremely bright auras that are seen on Ganymede. Those ones that are similar to those that we see here on Earth. The only difference between Ganymede's auroras and our auroras, however, is that ours are caused by the flow of particles from the sun, while the ones on Ganymede come from Jupiter itself. So there's this weird interaction between the two. And, just a final note on why this is important. Obviously, studying magnetospheres throughout the solar system not only helps scientists learn about the physical processes affecting this magnetic environment around the Earth, but it helps us understand the atmospheres around other potentially habitable worlds, both in our own solar system and in all of the exoplanets that we study. So the more that we can understand about this, the more that we understand about how magnetospheres react to each other and react to particles coming in, the more inferences that we can make about things like exoplanets, as well as understanding our own magnetosphere. So that's Ganymede.
I love the Galilean moons.
Yeah,
that's my contribution.
The Jovian moons.
Well, I mean, they're
you're calling them Galilean just because.
Yeah,
because
Galileo. They're the Galilean. There's 4 of them. The Jovian moons are all 80 million of them.
Yeah, that's 80 million. Yes, that's true.
Yeah, there's exactly 80 million.
Exactly. You heard it here first on Ad Astra. Write all letters to Jack. Tweet at Jack.
Yeah, tweet at me.
All your corrections.
Well, all right. So we're gonna finish out the show right now with 2 really big coming soon to space items. The first one is the Humans to Mars Summit is happening next week.
Woohoo!
So H2M is the biggest, most expansive, most awesome summit of all things Mars that ever happens in the universe. So you should definitely go. It's next Tuesday through Thursday. That would be May 8th through the 10th. There's programming all day. From registration opens at 7 a.m. going all the way to evening events ending at 8 or 9 p.m. It is a great event, and I will be there for all of it, and Newton, you'll be there for parts of it as well.
No, I'll just make like a cameo. That's about it.
That's all. That's all we could afford with Newton.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, yeah. So it's. I mean, you get to hear from a number of scientists, engineers, writers. It's sort of the intersection, as much as this show is an intersection between policy and technology. H2M is an intersection of policy, culture, technology, engineering, everything. It's an awesome experience, and I highly recommend that you go or watch the webcast. I think they webcast to about 1 million people every year watch it, so it's good. Any other recommendations, Newton, for H2M?
No, H2M is always a great conference. It's always great talks. There's very you find a very interesting group of folks that attend there. I don't mean interesting as weird. I just realized how that sounded.
Well, there are those people. Those people are there.
Those people are literally at every space event. But you find real very realistic discussions about where we currently are on our path to Mars. We're going to go there at some point, provided we don't end up in World War III.
Even if we do, maybe.
And
last-ditch effort.
No. We don't have any capacity to do that right now, especially if we go to World War III. But it really does give you a current status update, where we are, where people think and speculate that we're headed in terms of space travel. There's going to be a lot of talk about commercial organizations. There's going to be a lot of talk about how NASA fits in, how ESA fits in, and how all of these other space organizations fit in to this bigger picture of humans going to another planet within our solar system. If you've ever wanted something outside of science fiction to try to understand that, if you ever wanted to understand from a very realistic standpoint how we get there, you should attend Humans to Mars or watch all of the webcasts for Humans to Mars.
You will not regret it. It's a great event. And with the way that our scheduling for our episodes are. The episode after this, the one coming out on or around May 16th, will be all about H2M and the pursuit of human exploration of the Martian surface and orbit, or both. Who knows? I mean, that's why we're going to this conference, to figure out what the current plan is. So that's awesome. Another Mars thing that's coming up on Saturday, the launch of Mars Insight, which is the latest, greatest, most advanced lander that is going to be going to the Martian surface until Mars 2020 rover, which is launching in 2020. But Mars Insight will give us an insight into what the history of Mars is, what the surface is made of, as well as sort of what we can learn from the topography of Mars, from the just every aspect of the red planet and how it formed and its evolution and I guess decay into the state that it is in now. So that is launching on Saturday, and in the show notes there's a handy dandy guide for viewing the launch. If you are in California or traveling to California on Saturday, you will be able to see it. It is going to be the first interplanetary launch from the West Coast, which is also awesome.
West Side.
Yeah.
All right.
But yeah, that's all I got. Anything from you, Newton?
I got nothing.
All right. Well, as always, I'm Jack.
And I'm going to bed.
Ad Astra.